My name's Brian Meacham. I'm running this research project on reimagining the ICC performance code. And I want to welcome you to this roundtable discussion aimed to get input from building officials on performance codes, performance-based design, and where we might go in the future in these areas. I've sent out some background information, so I won't cover everything in detail. Just as a few quick notes, it's been more than 20 years since the first ICC performance code was developed. A lot has changed in that time in terms of different priorities and different ways of doing things. Energy performance wasn't very big at that time. Sustainability and resilience weren't really on the agenda. Some of those concepts aren't in the performance code. Aside from those types of issues, the performance code hasn't been particularly widely adopted, if at all, or used, sometimes administratively. But with all the advancements in different performance-based design areas for energy, resilience, structure, and so forth, with some international changes and priorities, it was felt that this might be a good time to think about whether there's a good opportunity to do something more with performance and maybe, as a first step, reimagine what a performance building code might look like for the US. And so we've had a survey run to get some initial perspectives, and I've been running roundtables with groups like this, but there's been architects, MEP energy people, structural engineers, fire protection engineers, architects. I'll be doing a roundtable with built fire officials next week. And so the idea is to have some initial discussions with smaller groups coming from more or less the same area, to have an open discussion about performance concepts, the code, what works, what doesn't, what's needed, and so forth. And so this is really for me to get your perspectives, and after the introduction, I'm not expecting to talk too much, but really looking to hear from you. Why aren't we doing more with performance? What do we need to make it better? What could enhancements be to the code, and so forth? And so I want to kick off, just with some introductions so that everybody knows who's around the virtual table here. And because this is going to be posted for others to listen to, it'll be good for them to understand, who's here, where you're at, and why you're joining, and maybe a couple of words about what you think about performance. And so with that, I'll just go around the room and ask people to invite based on who I see on the screen. Hopefully it won't change around too much, so I keep track of who's here. And we'll try to use, I want the discussion to be free-flowing, but if you can think to use the raise your hand, that might be a way to moderate flow. But I'll kick off. I'll ask Darren to kick off with introduction and reason for joining.
Thanks, Brian. Good morning, everybody, or afternoon. I don't know where everybody is. I think we're all in the US. Hopefully I'm on the East Coast. I'm Darren Hobbs. I'm the Director of Regulatory Compliance for the state of Connecticut. I oversee the development and the application and the future direction of our building fire safety and fire prevention codes here in Connecticut. I also oversee our programs for education of code officials, both when they want to get licensed and then their continuing education once they are licensed. I spent half my career in England, including my role with the national government, developing and educating people on the country's building regulations, which have been based on a functional model since 1985. That was born out of some of the Conservative Party's initiatives back then to deregulate pretty much everything from building regulations through to the railway services and everything else. You probably know the functional regulations are the extreme version of performance-based codes. And if you've had a chance to go through Brian's excellent concepts and trends slides, you'll see how some of the evolution has happened over the years. State of Connecticut's interest in this roundtable is that the broader initiative is hopefully going to help us improve the regulatory environment for our property owners, developers, and designers in Connecticut, but also help us advance code compliance for the people who live, work, and play in our state. One of the biggest challenges will be how we educate and support the code officials who will be presented with performance-based designs. We have a statewide building code with 169 municipalities, each with their own code officials and code official teams. So getting that buy-in of the concept of performance-based is going to be the key, I think, to any successful rollout of performance codes. I'm excited to be here, part of this discussion, and thanks for having me. Whatever I can contribute or learn here today, I'll be happy to do so. Thanks.
Thank you. Wayne.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Wayne Pimentel. I'm the building official for the town of Narragansett in Rhode Island, past president of the Rhode Island Building Officials Association. I look forward to participating in this work for performance codes. As you know, pretty much most building inspectors, building officials work on prescriptive. So I look forward to, again, as Darren had said, crossing that bridge to make this a more simple process for inspectors, designers, contractors as well. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to seeing how this develops and coming up with something that will work for everyone. Thanks.
Thank you. John Sue.
Good morning. My name is John Sue. Well, up until a year ago, I was the principal engineer and building official for the city of Seattle, Washington. We got involved in, let's see. I'm currently a technical consultant with the Washington Association of Building Officials, doing mostly code development work. Seattle got into the performance-based codes or performance-based design even before there were codes. Back in the late 1990s, with the design of a lot of the high-rise buildings going on. It was proposed by an engineer. We had to figure out how to decide whether or not this was okay. We've done some other performance designs since then, fire type designs, usually related to structural and things like that. I also did write an article about performance-based design, kind of, and how kind of the typical building official reluctance to use them. This is back in the, gosh, maybe 2012, 2013 timeframe. I think, no, sorry, 2002 to 2003, probably around there. And it was published in the Society for Fire Protection Engineer journal. I think I'll stop there. I got lots.
Great, thank you. Tom Allen.
Good morning. At least it's morning where I'm at. I'm Tom Allen, building official of Lake County, Florida. We're kind of a rural county, about 1,200 square miles, 350,000 population. Florida, I'm a past president of the Building Officials Association of Florida. I'm on the Building Membership Council with ICC and director for Region 9. Been involved in the code development process since 2004 on the international level and about the same in Florida on their state code modifications. Florida doesn't adopt the performance code. However, it is available to be used as an alternative. I'm looking forward to us being able to get this updated to current requirements as far as wind loading and things like that, so that it will be a viable alternative to be able to be used for unique structures.
Great, thank you. Let's go to Mark.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Mark Matheny with the build official for the city of Asheville here in Western North Carolina, in the mountains of North Carolina. We're about 95,000 population. I am the incoming co-chair of the Building Membership Council. I'm past president of the North Carolina Building Inspectors Association, also past president of Region 8. Had a great conversation with Brian just by chance at the gala that we had at the annual conference. We were sitting next to each other and just I think it was good chance, good timing As part of the Building Membership Council, I was the liaison for the Global Membership Council since 2018, and had some fascinating exposure there in listening to how Australia, New Zealand, England is putting these together. I did a couple of best practice webinars with them, and just to hear how that assessment and conformity and all that works was pretty spectacular. I've always been a fan of existing building code, chapter 14, kind of that performance-based section. I always tried to promote that and teach people the advantages to that and the reasons why you can actually use it. And had my first real exposure to performance when New Belgium built their brewery here in Asheville, probably 2012, 13. We had to actually incorporate a few performance methods in there along with the other prescriptive pieces, and that was a great experience. And so I'm very much looking forward to participating here. Thank you.
Thank you. Nick.
Good morning, afternoon. Nicholas Daniels, building official, City of Kingsville. Wanted to be involved in the discussion because I feel like it's been a long sought after thing where we've got 4,000 pages of code in the most recent adoption or so, give or take, and that just can't cover everything. And you get a lot of building officials that are hesitant towards the alternate means and methods. And I think this is just kind of try to bridge that gap between, and that's my reason for wanting to be here.
Thank you. Gary.
Thanks, Brian. Gary Lewis, the building official, soon to be retired, City of Summit. It was coming up on 25 years ago, I guess, Brian, at UI and the rest of that merry band got together and put together that first performance code that's out of date and not functional and not keeping up with the times and not even remotely adopted, not even widely adopted. But that being said, things change, times change, construction changes, expectations change, technological demands change. So I can tell you, Brian, as you well know, the SFPE is already well down the path on a parallel project to getting a performance code that is reflective of today's technologies and standards. I'm sort of in the background, but associated with that project as well. We use the performance code here because our alternate method language, which varies from the IBC and the IFC, is actually kind of crappy. And I'm glad we recorded this because now I can say it. Using the administrative pieces out of the performance code, even if we don't use the code itself, in my view, puts a certain amount of intellectual discipline and rigor to that alternate method process and forces everybody to go down that same path. And I don't want to use an introduction and make a speech, but something like this will have a role in nearly every community at some point in time, because there's almost always an alternate method. So whether it's a part of a building, an alternate method, or a pure performance design building, whether it is energy or New Jersey is very environmentally and climate forward, talking about new construction techniques, the code isn't going to catch up to them quickly enough. We're going to have alternate ways to deal with this. So I'm happy to be sitting here. Looked a lot different 25 years ago. I want you to know.
I could say the same for others of us too. Thank you. Sam.
Thanks, Gary. I'm Sam Steele, the City of Seattle Construction Inspection Manager, and I'm currently the Vice Chairman of the Major Jurisdictions Committee and the Secretary for Region 2. I'm eager to learn as much as I can on the evolution of this performance code because of where it is and just managing the inspections realm. So I welcome everybody here from this great city of Seattle. Thank you.
Thank you. Jack?
Good morning, everyone. Great to see all your smiling faces, except for Hope. She's frozen in time. But this is a great group of folks, and I was happy to join in when I got the invitation. I'll kind of me too on a lot of the things that Gary said, specifically regarding technology, advancement of materials, advancements of our energy codes, and our codes, as hard as we try in the BCACs and our code action committees, we cannot keep up with the technology. It's simply not possible in a 3-year cycle. So the performance code is critical. But a little bit about my background. I'm the CEO and president of Northwest Code Professionals and May Engineering. I have about 15 engineers that work for me and about 45 code officials. Most of our work is in Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. We do a ton of plan review services, and we get a lot of kind of major projects in jurisdictions where they may not be comfortable with the plan review, especially the structural provisions. And I've had the same battles throughout my career that Gary has in dealing with the alternate method. And when he says every building has an alternate method, just about, it's absolutely true. There's every project we're on, and the inspectors sometimes make those calls in the field, and they don't even get documented as a true alternate method, but based on experience and training, they know it's equivalent and they know it'll work. But there is problems with the existing building code. In my mind, I've never been a big fan of it. Most of our architects and engineers out there who submit documents based on that code don't know how to use it. Chapter 34, Oregon kept that adopted for a few extra years just for that reason. And I'm a bit of a historic building geek. I worked in the city of Astoria as a building official for about 10 years, and it's the oldest city west of the Mississippi. So 90% of the building stock in that community was a historic era home or a historic era commercial building. And so every day of my life was an alternate method without making somebody go through the entire process of that, trying to make the energy codes work with a historic building, or trying to make some of the restrictions based on occupancy. And maybe you had 3 stories of an apartment up there in 1850, and they had just been sealed off and doors closed for 60 years. Didn't change occupancy, didn't change use. How do we, from a performance standpoint, address these types of structures? And so I love my historic buildings. And I also was the past president of Region 2 for 2 terms, served on the Building Code Action Committee for 2 terms, the Energy Code Exam Committee for 2 terms, and a proud member of WABO. And so I'm glad to see the Washington guys here. Also a member of Oregon, slightly less pride there with that one, but I'm really pleased with WABO and the technology and how they discuss and advance the codes and code changes is why I say that. No knock against OBOA. My work also involves being on the board of the Wyoming Association of Permit Techs. So I'd like to bring that kind of view in there that's often forgotten when we develop codes and how we deal with the administrative chapter and some of the things they deal with at the counter. But all in all, I'm really excited about the performance concept. I went to the Leadership Academy in Georgia. I believe it was in year 2. And I had the privilege, honor, and pure joy of going through the Georgia Mercedes-Benz Stadium and getting to talk with Dwayne Garris about some of the technology, and the architect going through their essentially what is absolutely a performance code method of dealing with smoke and chimneys and creating spaces outside of the seating. And it was all modeled, computer modeled, even the exiting with individual icons shown in the true time it would take them to egress out of the structure. And so that got pretty exciting, and we weren't allowed to share the photos and some of the video that I got. And so this is going to be a great platform to talk about some of those opportunities to serve the public better and make a performance code that's usable, and maybe something that will be used even more than the existing building code in a lot of cases. So thanks everyone for joining in on this. I look forward to working with all of you.
Thank you very much. And Hope.
Jack, I am frozen in time because that is pre-gray hair era. So I'm Hope Medina with Shums Coda Associates, formerly Colorado Code Consulting before the merge. I have had the great opportunity of various tasks, such as I've been a permit tech, I'm an inspector, I'm a plans examiner, so I bring a wide gambit as far as experiences to this. While I am certified and perform various trades, I am probably more known for my energy and sustainability aspects of this great career that we've all enjoyed. And I'm currently the vice chair for the Sustainability Membership Council for another, 23 days, and then I will term out on that. So I'm really excited to see how any of my experiences or any of my thoughts can help move this code along. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe to kick things off, what I've heard is a lot of support for and need for performance-based approaches for a wide range of reasons: advancing technology, more complex buildings, sustainability, other issues. So maybe a first question is, why aren't we doing it more? Why isn't the performance code concept more readily accepted? What are the big challenges that need to be addressed to move along to a more performance environment? Things we have to tackle to make it more real. Does anyone want to take a first stab at that? Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, very simply is black and white, right? So the people that choose to work in our industry and the people that we work with and work around us are very black and white oriented. It's super easy to go into any one of those books and say, here's exactly what it says. And that's all I need. And then when you do exactly what it says, I'll be back. Right. And so why aren't we doing performance-based is because it's hard to live in that gray area. And that's what a majority of our work is gray. But that's the biggest challenge at the most basic level is that piece. And I see other people are raising their hands, so I'll go.
Yeah, thanks. John?
Yeah, I agree with that. The toughest part we found in bringing up new plans examiners, new inspectors, and things like that is teaching them judgment. You have to use judgment in this world, in this profession. And as Mark said, you have to be comfortable, as I put it, living in the gray. And so if you're not comfortable living in the gray, then it's really, really difficult. And I think a lot of people don't want to use their judgment. Again, it's easy to say, yeah, it says this is what it says, without trying to consider the exact circumstances of what's going on in the particular project. And so, yeah, you're having to step outside your comfort zone. I think a lot of building officials are risk averse, even more so than engineers sometimes. And so I think that plays into it a lot. They don't want to, I don't want to see my name in the newspaper because some building, something happened in some building. So I think that kind of plays into it. I think there's a lot of fear of liability. I see that a lot in discussions, even among my colleagues. And I think that again, those kind of factors play into it. They just don't want to take the risk. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Jack, and then Darren.
First, me too, along with Jonathan Sue just said, I was going to definitely bring up the liability, the fear of that. I do a lot of expert witness work, and it's maybe 0.1% is a jurisdiction even involved with the suits that I work in, and that might even be a really high number. And maybe one of the people missing on the panel is a representative of a company like City Insurance Services, CIS, one of those companies who specializes in insuring city and county governments. because, they fight that battle when it comes, and very, very rarely is the jurisdiction involved with these suits. The second thing I think is when a code sits stagnant, is not updated, doesn't get the excitement that maybe a code like the energy codes do right now. Even maybe the building code and fire code, now that we've had 21 years almost into that being an ICC code body, some of the spark wears off of that when we think we get it close and less people are involved with that old, I'm from Boca, or I'm an ICBO guy, or I'm a Southern Building Code guy. Some of that I think is gone. It's faded away as we all turn grayer and have less hair. We've already fought those battles in the trenches. So I think just a code being stagnant for a long time. And then the last thing is somebody has to have a conversation. So I'm really fortunate that Brian had a conversation with Mark at the gala. Sometimes that's all it takes to initiate change and realize that there's a lot more folks out there who have the same concern and the same desire for something better. And so this is probably step one, but this is how we get there, is somebody start the conversation.
Thank you. Darren.
So I have to be honest, prior to me being invited to be part of this group, I hadn't really looked at the performance code. So I've spent a little time this morning going through it. And some of the things that stood out to me were that it strikes me as a bit of a black box art. And what I mean by that is that it seems the way that the chapter 1 stuff is framed, the building official would receive a performance-based design and be expected to accept it without too much scrutiny. And the reason why there couldn't be too much scrutiny is because what would the basis for that scrutiny be? There's no base technical requirement that they can turn to and say, well, hold on a second, here it says you have to have done X, Y, and Z. And that's that familiarity with the prescriptive stuff where it's, travel distance shall be, no more than X number of feet, etc. So without that baseline, how do they question something? And I noticed that the chapter 1 of the code says something to the effect of, I got it here somewhere, the code official shall be responsible to perform a knowledgeable review of the proposed design and shall retain competent assistants to perform the review. That tells me enough right there that we haven't trained our code officials right now to do that knowledgeable review. And most towns are not going to want to have to spend any more money to go get a consultant or somebody else who can perform that review on their behalf. So at that point, you hit a dead roadblock. And I don't think that at the state level here, we could ever get anybody to adopt, accept the adoptions of a performance code if we have those obstacles right out of the gate.
Great, thank you. Gary.
And Mark, I know my face is forgettable, but I was the guy that was sitting on the other side of Brian at the gala. It's good to see you again, my friend. One of the, I guess, few silver linings or positive notes is SFPE, and I've been working with them, has run educational programs at ICC the last 3 years that they've met. We were off for a year. But the bottom line of that is each of the 3 sessions that we did, the attendance by code officials has gone up exponentially. In fact, 2 years ago, I think staff said it was the best attended educational function that they offered. So I think that those things are positive signs. We have a long way to go, and I don't think anybody would say otherwise. But that being said, I think there are some encouraging signs far ahead of where we were 20 years ago. The code was adopted by the ICC membership without a lot of discussion. I mean, there were certain folks who had very strong feelings about certain aspects. But this was a brand new code adoption. It wasn't updating the IBC or updating the IFC. And in my view, by that time, I guess Bob Weber stepped down, I was chairing. I was amazed by how little public discussion there was, which tells me that there was just a very, comparatively speaking, compressed or depressed level of comprehension on what it meant at that point. but I am very, very encouraged by the increasing level of participation by building code and fire code folks who see this not as something inevitable that they're just going to have to live with, but as a tool in the box, whether you're repurposing an old existing building, building something that is way outside of the IBC box, or just configuring a small portion of a project, trying to ascertain or equate it to the same intent, whatever that word means, of the IBC or IFC for that particular aspect of a building. So I honestly, I'm a half full glass kind of guy, and I see that as a silver lining and or bright spot, and even though we have a long way to go.
Great. Tom?
Yeah, of course, one of the big problems we've always had with this is getting the education out there of what this is and how to use it. There really hasn't been that much education about this out there. I know about it because I've been involved in the code change method processes for years, and I've seen it used as an alternative. And that kind of the selling point is this is a wonderful alternative for somebody who's building something that doesn't fit into the prescriptive realm. I had the advantage years ago of working at Reedy Creek, which is Disney's building department in Florida. And there's all kinds of things there that have to be done in a performance method because there's not really a prescriptive method for building a 5-story fiberglass castle. And performance is how you do those things. And as far as the administrative part, we can always tweak that to that it becomes the responsibility of whoever's proposing this alternative or using this method through the performance code to pay for the evaluation if you don't have people on staff that can provide that expertise.
Great, thank you. Darren, did you have another comment?
I just wanted to follow up on a couple of comments. I would say, I personally, I'm a fan of performance-based codes and everything that it can deliver. But the reality of the challenges is what we face. I like the comment somebody made, and I'm sorry, I forgot who it was, about using performance code as a framework for that alternative compliance stuff. That's something that we come across a lot in our industry, not just here in Connecticut, I'm sure. And understanding how to properly apply that code section as it is now is sometimes challenging, and having that performance code as a framework to help us do that is going to be a real helpful tool, I think. And the other thing I just want to follow up on, I think it was Gary just saying there, is how we rejuvenate our existing building stock. The existing building code takes us partway down that path, but it doesn't always get us as far as some design professionals would like and some building owners would like. So I think that's something very worth mentioning and putting up in the forefront of the reasons to adopt a performance code.
Thank you. John?
Yeah, thank you. Just want to build a little bit on what Darren said earlier. I was thinking about it. Usability of this code. We did look at it in Seattle a few times, early on. And I would say personally, I didn't find it all that helpful. The code as written, it does give you some of the factors you need to think about, but again, doesn't give you an idea of what's acceptable. Basically, the idea is you got to sit down with the design professionals and you negotiate what's acceptable. Is kind of the way I took it. And again, so there's no basis other than, okay, what I'm comparing to is the prescriptive code, as Darren kind of implied. And so what's okay, what point of that do you compare to? We've run into that recently on a lot of these timed egress analyses that we're getting now. And it's kind of, okay, yeah, you're showing this, but what's acceptable? Yeah, what's an acceptable amount of time to be out of the building? What's the acceptable amount of time? What are the parameters you put into that? Do you assume one stair is blocked, or do you assume what are the assumptions you put into your model? And those things, again, I don't see much guidance on, and so that's been been kind of the difficulty in actually using that. We end up again just sitting down and using our own judgment and saying, okay, this this is, you compare it to this part of the code. If you had a code compliant building, then this is what you get. So run a model that shows that. Now show me this new one and show me how it compares. Right, that's what you end up with, and I'm not certain that's exactly how it's supposed to work, but that's kind of the best we end up with.
Thank you. Nick.
Okay. Yeah, heard a lot of good things and kind of want to summarize on a couple of them. I agree with a lot of people. I think with the last couple of years we've seen a lot of changes. I personally thought we would have seen a slow in building due to the pandemic and cost of materials, but we didn't. At least in a lot of the places where I know people, where I've worked, and even here in South Texas, we didn't see that slowdown. I think a lot of it is going to be people are busy, and it's been everybody's had to adapt. It's been an adaptation for whether you are trying to run a building department that's trying to do virtual inspections at this point, or how are we limiting face-to-face interactions. So I don't know that a lot of it is going to be building officials just don't want to accept alternate means and methods. It's time. There's a lot of time involved in researching or figuring this stuff out, and I think that's going to be a lot of it. So to try to bring it full circle, what everybody's been talking about, I think this needs to be a framework of what needs to happen there, because again, I've heard the liability of the building official. Again, gross negligence is a stretch to prove on that. So I don't know so much as liability as much as building officials want to have the perception of, we've got this code, this is what we went out of, instead of having to say, well, I looked at this prescriptive, it meets or exceeds what was there.
Thank you. So before I go back to Darren, I want to maybe pick up on a few themes. A lot of good things have been discussed. One of the themes that seems to be coming out is that the current performance code lacks quantification, right? You can't actually measure the level of performance. And I think that was a conscious decision at the time, in part because the ability to demonstrate performance was not as robust as it might currently be. So if we look at where different areas have advanced, in structural design for extreme events, wind, earthquake events, there's a lot of methodologies and clear criteria. Energy wasn't really on the agenda 20, 25 years ago in a performance realm, but now it's largely done as performance, outcome-based performance standards. And that's actually law in some areas where you have this combination of being able to use modeling for the time of compliance, but also have to achieve the performance outcomes for the building in use. This concept wasn't really in there, and functional recovery, which is being developed, in NIST and FEMA and others to look at, not only do you have to design the building for certain performance in its normal use, you have to design it for that extreme event and understand how long it's going to take to bring that back into some level of performance in concert with the resilience objectives of the community. Well, resilience objectives of the community wasn't on the agenda, before 9/11 and Katrina and everything else. So we have these concepts that we're trying to achieve with a code structure that doesn't actually say what performance it's trying to deliver, nor how you understand how it supports sustainability or resilience objectives. So it seems like a performance code that can clearly articulate what the performance objectives are with quantitative measures that can be used to describe acceptable performance that are connected to design methods and methods of verification that are agreed as means to demonstrate that performance is achieved, would go a long way to addressing, many of the shortcomings and why it hasn't been used to date. And also, another factor is the confidence. If the engineering, disciplines are able to show that the tools they use can be used with confidence, and the building officials gain confidence in the use of those tools, then the time requirement, minimizes a little bit for both sides. And notwithstanding all of that, having, third-party peer review mechanisms are always a good way to go as well. So it seems like if, we can tackle, the quantification issue, so the clarity of performance objectives, the quantification of the measure of performance, the connection of the design and verification methods, and mechanisms to support the review, we'd make a huge step forward. Is there support for that, type of thinking and that way to kind of approach the problem? See a lot of thumbs up. That's a good thing. So, and I think that's good because I'm hearing that same type of feedback from the other groups. And, it's, Gary can attest to this. When we were doing this the first time around, when you get a bunch of people in from different perspectives, more time is dealt arguing just because you don't like the discipline than about discussing the issue. And so now by discussing the issue in like groups, we'll find out that we actually all kind of think in the same way, which hopefully will move things along. So that's a good outcome or a good highlight so far. I've got Darren and Jack with some additional comments to keep us rolling. Darren.
Thanks, Brian. I just have a couple of quick things. One of the things we did in the UK when our functional / performance-based regulations first came out, they were used pretty lightly. They weren't challenging to the building officials. But as time went by, then they became more and more challenging as people got more and more comfortable with them. And some of the designs became more creative, etc. So one of the things we did at the UK government level was start to publish some documents that would help. They'd almost be like translation documents for code officials, help to understand some of the more complex aspects of performance-based design in language that they could understand. So we published a book, for example, on fire safety engineering for the building official. It wasn't teaching them to be a fire safety engineer. It was basically a dictionary of all the terms and what it meant and what you should look out for if you see these terms put forward in a performance-based design. So it helped them have a more informed discussion with design teams, and that was really effective. The other thing I wanted to go back with quickly on was Nick mentioned, the time available to building officials. And I think it's maybe not for this group, but for another group or for us individually to keep an eye on that bigger picture stuff. The state of Connecticut, as I'm sure with most jurisdictions these days, is having a real problem with recruiting code officials. There's not enough of them to do the work that needs to be done. We've put more and more on the code officials over the years, and now they're expected to be, experts, not just jacks of all trades. Forgive me, Jack, but experts in all trades. And to take it to the next level, which is performance-based, would be asking a lot of the code officials that we have. They're not staffed well enough. They're not educated on the things they need to be educated on to be able to make that happen. So here in Connecticut, we're having to look at alternative ways to get to compliance. And maybe the code official becomes more of a conduit for code compliance documentation, but isn't necessarily the expert, or isn't expected to be the expert on the ground or in the office for every single aspect of this. And they start to accept reports from people, better qualified people, to form a complete picture of compliance, still with the opportunity to do their own reviews and inspections. But that's one of the things we're looking at. We're also looking at, can we do something at the root of education? Can we bring in younger people in the industry who want to be a code professional from the outset, and we develop some trainee / apprenticeship programs for them and get them educated from the ground up that way. So there's a bigger picture here, I think, that has to be figured out. We can't just launch a performance code at the industry and expect it to work. There's a lot of moving parts and a lot of broken moving parts right now that need to be fixed as well.
Thank you. Jack.
And again, I was kind of me too on what Gary was saying. My feeling on this is, if you look at chapter 1 specifically in the administrative provisions, there's a lot in there that's wonky. I hate to use such a high-tech term as wonky, but you look at sections that require compliance essentially with the ICC family of codes. What does that mean? There's a lot of kind of back and forth about design professionals and documentation and how that's required. But also there's a lot of follow-up that I've tried to avoid, at least from my technical opinion side at code hearings for the last 9 years or so. And that's adding additional documentation or processes into codes that are more expensive and more costly and more time consuming also for the building official without finding some way to, recover those costs. And especially in states where you have a dedicated fund where you're only allowed to use your permit fees to run building department programs. You can't use it for any other purpose, and you don't get support from the general fund typically in those states that have those rules. But some of the after the fact documentation or monitoring of maintenance, that's going to be a tricky wicket to fix the language on. But I think, you would need to start with a complete administrative chapter overhaul. And making the verbiage align with our other administrative chapters. Doesn't have to be the same, but it does need to be consistent in kind of how we require and what we require after the fact. Who's going to pay for those follow-up reviews and inspections every 2 years or 3 years or 4 years, whatever the building official decides is the required amount of follow-up. And so I think that's critical. And then to jump on Darren's point that I really agreed with, I think if you're going to make this code usable and make it popular enough that people will begin to trust it, I think you do have to develop a handbook at the same time. And so as you're developing this code and as we pull out these critical components that need overhauled or worked or fixed or added, especially with kind of a 20-year gap without a lot of attention to this code, you need a handbook that puts these down to simpler terms and gives some examples of what might be required or what the building official might expect.
Thank you. Wayne.
Thanks. Perhaps we can kind of piggyback on some of the communities, jurisdictions out there that have dealt with performance code. And look specifically as an example, it would be like Clark County, Nevada. Ron Lynn out there dealt with probably most of the buildings were performance-based. And, looking and using that as a model of how we move forward to develop those standards as using that sort of as an example. I know, Brian, you had mentioned third-party reviewers, and I think that's probably somewhere where we're going to need to go as building officials because we just don't have the time, the staff, the expertise to look at some of these very unique performance-based applications. But I think it's definitely like I said previously, this is a good group to move this forward because it's always been a very gray area. Nobody wants to touch, nobody wants to address it. So I think it's certainly long overdue. It's going to be a challenge. It's certainly, it's a performance based. It's not cut and dry. It's not black and white. And but I think it's good to see a group of people finally getting together to address it and perhaps make it a better product that can be used by more people. Thanks.
Thank you. So maybe a couple more observations and discussion points. And, it's good that Darren's here because he'll correct me if I'm wrong with my characterization of the English regulatory system. But, for many countries, who have performance or functional or objective based, as the case in Canada, the general framework is the top level document is your functional statements or performance objectives as the regulatory requirement. Then you have typically two options. One is applying what is nominally the prescriptive option, often called a deemed to comply or deemed to satisfy approach, the approved documents in England, or you can take a more performance-based approach. So we do it kind of differently in that the top is the prescriptive and everything has to be an alternative to terms that are really hard to achieve in some disciplines, such as equivalency. You know, what's equivalent to a 2-hour fire resistant column? Is it a lower fire resistance rating and sprinkler to control the fire load? Is it something else, or is it only a different cover to give you a 2-hour resistance? So part of the challenge is whenever we're talking about equivalency is it's really hard to say equivalent to what. The other problem is we don't know the fundamental performance. So if you're doing a comparative analysis, and it's been mentioned a few times, fire and evacuation. Well, is the performance objective to get people out of the building within a certain amount of time? The IBC doesn't say that. The IBC actually doesn't say anything about people. It talks about systems that you have to have. And so what is the real performance objective that you're trying to achieve? And can we put numbers on that? So a little bit the challenge also, I think, is that when you're always thinking about equivalency, you're not thinking about performance. You know, so what is it, the performance that we're trying to achieve with the building, and how do we get there? And so that begs the question, you know, is there any potential to flip the system? That there's this top level document that lays out those performance objectives and technical criteria in the IBC and the IMC and the every other I is, you know, a means to demonstrate compliance, but not the mandatory means, and that you have this other pathway, or is that just, you know, too far, too fast? So that's one question. And the other question, again, might be getting into a little bit of controversial perspective, is that some of the other countries that have performance-based codes have also grappled with this issue that the regulatory enforcement officials, government, doesn't have the resource to do all of the review. And some countries have instituted private review on an equal status with government review. Australia is an example. I think England has a two local with the building control option. Is that an opportunity? You know, peer review is widely used. It's required in some jurisdictions for seismic, for example, in California. And in Massachusetts for fire, if you're going to do an alternative design, you have to have a peer review, and the entity seeking the alternate design has to pay for that. So there are mechanisms to, you know, cover the cost of those reviews. So I guess the question around the review and the time side is, are we ready to have more self-certification or private approvals within our structure to help provide some balance? And how would that interaction look with the government responsibility for review? So I see Darren's had his hand up, and then I'll go to Mark. So Darren.
Thanks, Brian. You made some great points. I'm going to try and touch on a few of them as quick as I can for the sake of everybody's sanity. You mentioned the building control system in England. Building control is what we call the building code profession. The building code enforcers in England are colloquially known as building control. We have one of the other things that Margaret Thatcher did back in the 1980s, in addition to putting a functional code out there, was to introduce competition in the building control marketplace, so that a local authority, a municipal building official, became in competition with private sector building officials. So a developer could choose whether they went to the municipality or whether they went to a private sector building official to get their code services, both reviews and inspections. So that's that dichotomy we have there at that level. Once you've chosen one of those, if you go to the local municipality or you go to the private sector, you stay with them. You don't hop to one or the other to get a portion of your code services. Once you put your finger in that bucket, you're in that bucket. One of the safeguards or one of the checks and balances we had in the UK for these kind of performance-based issues was what we call determinations. So with a lowercase d, your code official at the local level, when presented with one of these designs, would have to make a determination whether they felt that it was compliant or not. If they weren't sure, or the designer wasn't sure, they could refer that up to in our case in England, the national government. Here would be the state government, in most cases, for an official determination, an uppercase D, if you like. And then we would review the design or the proposal to see if it was, in compliance with the base requirement, which would be the functional or objective or whatever requirement. We had a couple of examples, one of the famous high rises in London where they were required to, by the more prescriptive methods, to provide 3 hours fire resistance rating to the structural frame, and they only wanted to provide 90 minutes, for example, a big knockdown in standard, but they provided some other features that they felt would offset that. So those kind of things came up to us at the national level. No code official would want to take that liability. I think this was maybe Nick's point earlier about liability, somebody's point earlier about liability. Who wants to take that kind of liability at the local level, right? So naturally, some of these things would always bubble up to the national or state level. When you talk about flipping the system, the challenge I think we have here in the US is that we have, the 50 different states, and within those 50 states, there are some county level code systems and structures. How do we flip the system on a national level and get it to fit all of those 50 states? I think some of that work has to be done legislatively at the local level, at the state and county levels, to make that work. And then can we make a model performance code that fits into all those? That's going to be quite a challenge, I think. And then the final point I want to make quickly is that here in Connecticut, we have what we call threshold structures. We had a disaster during construction back in the late 80s where some lift slab construction collapsed during construction, killed a bunch of construction workers. So as a result, we instituted in our statutes a requirement that threshold structures, which are those that exceed certain heights, areas, occupancy levels, etc., more larger, more high risk, would have to have a third-party engineering review on their primary structural frame. So we have that already in Connecticut for that purpose. And I think that's something you could build off for a performance-based code for maybe the structural or some of those other key elements that would have, potentially have to have some kind of confidence review done on them.
Thank you. Mark.
Yeah, thanks. Some of the points I had have just been brought up, so you get a much more shortened version. But an interesting thing, excuse me, in listening to the conversations, and Darren's been helpful in this as well. But John Gibson from England and listening to Australia and New Zealand who have this in place, right? They're already operating in some version of this. Really, a challenge that they're finding is the certification of that additional organization, right? And what the what the control mechanism of that level of certification is. And so what happens is we have our own certification, whether it's interior with your state or through ICC at that level of building official or inspector or certification and plan reviewers. And then as we take this up to different levels, these organizations, whether they're third party or private sector groups, are going to have some level of certification. And then there's basically the auditing or the control mechanism of maintaining their levels of certification. And I just bring that up because that obviously we have to get there in some version. And I think there's a path to probably get there, but we just always have to be aware that the countries that already have this are struggling with it, right? So these are points that they bring up as to, what are the best practices that they're doing? Well, one of them is how do we confirm the certification of the third-party organizations, because we're going to depend on them as we don't have enough of us, or as we're laying some of the heavier, more concentrated, more engineering designs onto other organizations. How do we pick up and control that level of certification? Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Mark, you just made a couple of my point. What I was going to say, I'm going to me too on that. In Seattle, we have a fairly large engineering staff. When I was there, we had about 14, 15, 16, somewhere around there, engineers. and auditing them was hard enough. Now let's talk about auditing third-party reviewers and making sure that they're doing what they're supposed to do is quite a challenge. We ended up actually back in the 90s. Seattle did hire on some third-party reviewers, and no offense to those. I know there are folks out there who are third-party reviewers, yeah, and no offense to them. But when we started auditing their work, we discovered a lot of stuff that we felt they weren't doing correctly. Right. And so eventually I got to the point where we said it's not worth it to us. We're not going to have third parties because it takes us too much time to deal with the applicants to correct these errors or whatever. And so it all depends on the quality of who you hire. For our peer reviews for the structural, we actually hire the peer reviewers. The owner pays us a fee. Basically, we're a pass through for the fees. So the owner pays us, but we hire the peer reviewer, and so the peer reviewer is working for us, not the owner. And I think that that's a separation we kind of want to keep, because once the owner starts hiring the third party, then I start worrying about, is there a conflict of interest there? So I think that's would be the big thing we'd have to avoid if we start going down this third party review path. As far as, does it make a difference if you have the functional statement and then have two paths to go, prescriptive or performance? I'm not certain that would kind of change the playing field here. To me, I don't see that making that much of a difference, I guess, because in my mind, it's still, the performance code is still available. Our performance methods are available. You just have to come and talk to the building official. And whether the building official then it comes down to, again, is the building official willing to accept that? But to me, that's still an option. It's always an option. We always talk about it in the code hearings. Alternate means is always an option. And it's just a question of who's willing to use them. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Gary.
Yeah, this will be brief. I think that ICC and the code community in general are going to be faced with some paths. One is, I think the subject that we've just spoken about is how do we make it usable and marketable and effective. But in heading down that path, I think we have to be aware that at some point in performance-based design and PBD, there's a fork in the road, meaning you're doing something that has not gained consensus approval, whether it's an approach to part of a design up to and including the whole design. And hand in hand with that are not just increased costs in the upfront design, engineering, and documentation, but the committee originally was very aware of bounding that approval to say it's okay to do this in the following contexts. But oftentimes those contexts were essential to the bounding of the approval. So when we talk about we can't logistically conduct these periodic reviews, there has to be some expense give and take to make sure that which we signed on to as an AHJ initially is still being operated in the same manner. Meaning if I have a bunch of healthy ambulatory 50-year-olds in a certain occupancy that did an egress analysis, and next thing you know, all of those folks are plus 80 and not so ambulatory, the context of that approval may be different. So the committee was very conservative, I think. Were we too conservative? That probably remains to be seen, but we're very conservative in making sure that if we were diverting from a prescriptive based approach to a facet of a design, that we had the right boundaries and the right mechanisms to make sure that the conditions under which that was approved, we do things like managing change and recertifying. I think there's a role for that in performance-based design to some degree going forward, even if that represents a challenge for the AHJ. Thanks.
Thanks, Gary. I might add some of my own bias and commentary here. I think the committee didn't go far enough. I think documentation and follow-up and continued demonstration of performance is really important. And I think what we tried to do with the deed restriction to make sure that somebody can't say that the reports and documentation went away as the building changed hands, we did what we could. But there are other mechanisms. New Zealand, for example, has what they call the building warrant of fitness, where any safety critical or unique system that's approved for performance, the owner is obligated to submit every year a statement that the conditions of that approval are maintained and it's subject to audit on a periodic basis. So it puts the liability right back on the building owner that they maintain to the agreement of the design, and it can be audited by whoever it should be, fire service, energy performance structure, whatever. So I think more can be done in that direction, which would be kind of worth exploring more if this, code development, if ICC decides to take this on in a big way. One other comment that, I wanted to come back to, and before I go to Darren, is to build off of what Mark and John were saying a bit, this whole area of competency qualifications and certifications. And it ties into a little bit this bifurcation of when you go prescriptive versus performance. Not every building needs a performance analysis. Not everyone is qualified to do performance, in my humble opinion. And why are we allowing people who don't know what they are doing and aren't doing things correctly to be working in an area that requires a high level of knowledge and, I'll have to say it publicly, but ethics, which, is really important to the professional practice side, because you're not going to get the confidence on the enforcement side if you don't have confidence in the people doing the work. And it's all part of the system that I think needs to be addressed to make the system work. So I any more thoughts around those areas would be welcome as well. I'll go to Darren and then on to Jack.
Thanks, Brian. I just wanted to say how important what you and Gary had just said about understanding the risk. I mean, we're talking about risk assessment in a very general sense. And when anybody carries out a risk assessment, you got to state what your assumptions were behind that assessment. You got to be qualified to do that assessment, of course, as well. One of the things we did in the UK was to we changed the whole makeup of the fire safety code / regulations to make them entirely risk assessment based, which had to start with the building code review at the beginning, the building regulation review at the beginning. The culmination of the design was to present the building with a document that explained all the assumptions that went into its design, how it would be maintained, how it would be operated, etc. And that became the basis then for what became an ongoing live document that had to be maintained live, not once every year, every 5 years, but it had to be a live document. If you changed out a fire rated door, or you changed out any element of the building that would impact that risk assessment, it had to be documented, and why you did it and how you did it would be documented along with it. And then the fire marshal, in our terms, would then be able to visit that document at any moment in time and get a history of what had been done to the building, starting with its original design concept and all the alterations that were done since. But that required everybody in the process to have some kind of responsibility. The person that did the original design is responsible for capturing all that. The person that does any kind of alteration or service or maintenance in the future has some responsibility. So they were all deemed to be responsible people under the law who would be responsible and culpable if anything went wrong. The only big question mark I have over this whole thing that I'll probably finish up with saying is, and I think it might have been Gary that mentioned this, is or you, Brian, but we don't expect to see a lot of these performance-based designs, and if we do, they may not be for the whole building. They might be for one element. They might be for the means of egress system or the fire resistance rated system, or for one particular part of it. So how do we be partly prescriptive, partly performance-based, and make that work? How does that all hold together and still function in a cohesive way? I think it's going to be one of the challenges. Is it just for one part of the building? Is it we've got a travel distance issue at one part of the building? We're going to use performance-based design to show that we can have 700 feet there where prescriptively we're only allowed 200. Just that one portion gets treated under performance code. And then how's that captured and recorded and then understood for the life of the building?
Thank you. Jack.
Yeah, just to address a little bit of the concept and concerns and some of the discussion regarding third-party review and ethics or technical. There's always going to be the what I always say when I give speeches about training my plans examiners and reviewing work that's been stamped by a licensed engineer. I remind them that 49 people finished in the bottom half of their engineering degree program every year. And so they still graduated and they still got a degree and they're still performing engineering every day. And so you cannot look at a document and it has an engineer stamp on it and assume everything's going to be okay. And there's a lot of building officials who do that. You see it in the Code Geek chat sessions and social media. Well, if it's stamped, they own it. Well, that's not what we're tasked to do in our lives as plans examiners and building officials. It's to make sure it's correct and that it's safe. And so we do track that a bit in our plan review processes, and about 40% of the engineering we receive on large projects has technical structural code issues with it. And so we require correction to that. So I get alarmed when I see people say, well, it's stamped. And so love that and accept it and move on. Additionally, I live in a state where, just as an example to the trying to figure out qualified versus certified or licensed, you can become a commercial electrical inspector or a commercial plumbing inspector just because you have a degree in engineering. You can go take the exam tomorrow. Somebody who's been an inspector for 20 years under training in Oregon could not do that because you don't have that degree. Well, the same can be true with a commercial plans examiner certification in Oregon. An engineer can just go take the exam, and if he passes it, he's okay to go start doing inspections right away out in the field. And an architect as well. And architects in the major degree programs in Oregon and across a lot of the country, when you look into it, they don't have a requirement for any code classes, any fire code classes. And so it's definitely a big concern. I think if you want to look at Chapter 1 and some administrative things that you could do perhaps to create some comfort, or at least look at the concept of another certification or accreditation, like the building department program accreditation. If you want to do third-party peer review, here's the accreditation process, similar to how in some ways WABO has a special inspector evaluation program. And maybe within that, there's some minimum requirements. Not only do you have a degree in architecture or engineering, like Chapter 1 talks about quite a bit, there's a lot of architects, quite frankly, I don't want them submitting anything to me for structural and fire life safety as an example, and they could, given the current language, and we evaluate that. But maybe the accreditation says you're already licensed in your jurisdiction as an architect or an engineer, and you have ICC certification as a commercial plans examiner and a fire plans examiner if you're going to be within the scope of doing a peer review, or if you're within the scope of doing supervision of the project under construction as the architect or engineer of record. There needs to be more than just one license or one certification, or in many cases, you're an architect or an engineer with no certifications at all. So I think that's an area that maybe needs to be addressed, either refined within the administrative chapter, or we look at potentially ICC developing an accreditation or a certification for third-party peer review based on using that in conjunction with the performance code. So just a few thoughts.
Thank you. John.
Yeah, since you raised the question of kind of competence, I and a little bit, Jack, what I don't like is this reliance on certifications. It's exactly the same thing. License and certification does not equal competence. And the problem is you can't judge competence until you've actually started talking to them, until you've seen their work and things like that. I've had several fire protection engineers submit stuff to us. And I'm not a licensed fire protection engineer, but I know that this isn't right. And so, you know, the difficulties again, it becomes how do you get that, and how do the only way we can do it these days is take a test, and you get people who can pass tests, right? For our plans examiners, right? If you require them to get a certification, well, all you got to do is figure out how to pass that test, right? That doesn't tell you how good they are, and you can't tell that until you actually look at their work. So I don't know what the answer to that is, but that I think that is somewhat of a barrier that we do have. Yes, we have everything from the A plus engineers and architects to the C minus architects and engineers. They say the structural engineer exam is aimed for the C minus engineer. And so it's not easy to pass though still, but it's still just a test and doesn't really tell you competence. So how you judge competence, I think, is a big issue.
John, we didn't all finish top in our class.
Thanks, John.
Neither did I.
That'd be like number 2.
Mark.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. To your point, you mentioned in your conversation about this control measure idea as to when you hit that, and honestly, when you brought that up, it kind of brought to mind there. I don't think this is such a hard sell necessarily, because I know Darren has it. He mentioned it, and I know Tom has it in the Florida code about this threshold building. Right, once you hit a threshold building, you're mandated to go to this next step, and I think that's a pretty easy piece to help to sell when you're going performance and prescriptive. And I think another part that may be advantageous, that may be helpful, that's already basically in chapter 17, is when we're talking about special inspectors, right? So here's points that you have to, when you hit these points, you need a special inspector for this. And I think that might help be kind of a selling point for when you're not doing the whole building, right? So to your point, Darren, about the egress at 700 feet, well, that part might actually need that, whatever we're going to call this third party person, that might need that performance review where everything else can fit within that. And those are just the points I wanted to bring up on that. And Jack, actually, to your point, honestly, I really do like that idea of accreditation, right? So can this next group, this third party group or whatever they are they IAS accredited? And that may help as part of that bigger conversation.
Thank you. And Nick.
Okay. As far as it goes with the accreditation / regulation, I don't want us to kind of overstep our bounds on that with the writing of this. I mean, as your local D- student here, again, sometimes, yeah, the C- architect or engineer may have been as great. I get torn on this because I'm looking at a engineering letter that just came in, and it says we're going to build structural steel in compliance with IBC, and then he put his stamp on it. So I get both sides, but then again, I'm the one looking at it, reviewing this. So back to chapter 17, would it be easier just to leave it up to the local building official or the authority having jurisdiction of, if you meet this criteria, the authority having jurisdiction can still have a regulation or a say in whether or not you are allowed to do this in that area. I don't think we should get too far into creating the criteria as much as just saying, if it's going to be engineers that can look at it, then it's engineers. I don't know that we would want to impose further onto that. That's already state and locally regulated as is.
Thank you. I'm conscious of the time. We've had a great discussion and we're almost out of time. I would like to give a once around for last comments. A couple of people we haven't heard much from, Hope and Sam. So I might ask Hope if to start, if you have any comments or feedbacks, things that we should be considering we haven't been discussing, that would be great.
You know what, I think there's always going to be something that we need to consider, and just kind of taking in what kind of what's been said. I'm not sure that there's really much more that I can add on to it. I mean, they're all really valid points and a lot of things to be thinking about and try to determine what the next move is. And I think that's probably my question is, where do you see the next move coming from this series of meetings?
Thank you. And I guess I'll address that now instead of at the end. But so the next steps will be, once I finish up the roundtable's first round, which should be next week. So for this roundtable, I'll write up a summary. I'll set up a Dropbox site. I'll send you the link to the summary and the recording just to make sure I've captured everything correctly. That's what I've been doing with each of the roundtables. I'll do it with the last one next week. Then all of the roundtable recordings will be posted with a brief summary of the key takeaways from each roundtable session. And the plan for next year is that we're looking to have a workshop to bring all the different groups together, which will probably be over 2 days, over a 2-week period. So the idea that we're all virtual is to have one session, probably the afternoon Eastern time of February 2nd, 4 hours or so, where there'll be some initial presentations and perspectives about the project and the process. I will have by then have kind of summarized where we have a lot of commonality and where there's big issues to address. And then we'll break out into at least one breakout session during that meeting to tackle one of the topics that may be quantification of performance or competency or one of these many themes. Then the groups will be assigned homework, and over a 2-week period, the intent would be for those groups to get together like you would in an in-person 2-day workshop period to work on items and report back. And then 2 weeks later, so around the 16th of February, would be another 4-hour session that would be the reporting out of the different workshop sessions. Coming out of that, what I'm hopeful is that we have a pretty clear sense of, and hopefully pretty broad consensus among the participants of, what would be needed in the next generation performance code. What are the key areas to tackle, like quantification, verification methods, competency, peer review. I from that would look to draft an outline that could be used for development of a product forward. Then I would write that up in a report, submit it to ICC with a recommendation, which I would hope would be to, here's an effort that there's a lot of support going forward for. Here's a framework. It's up to you how you set up the committees, but take it forward. For this group in particular, I would ask if, not only if you're interested to join the workshop, but also, it's been really good discussion. We couldn't get to everything, but would you be interested to have another session sometime over the next couple of months or so to add more input? Because I think having the input is helpful going forward. So that's kind of the next steps. I'm collecting research, presenting a structure to ICC and making a recommendation. And I'm hopeful that they'll take that and say, this needs to go forward, and then put some real thought into what kind of committee structure is needed with support to get information into that to take the next step forward. So sorry, it was a little bit of a long discussion, but that's where I see the plan going forward. We're at time, but I want to keep going if you'll indulge me, and maybe go around the room and keep asking people for, you know, last bits of input and comments. I'll go to Sam.
Thanks, Brian. The one thing that I'm seeing as a common theme is the competency and the requirements around that. And with the number of high rises that we're building in Seattle, we have a lot of issues in the inspections realm as far as the smoke control and pressurization, special inspections. And that's a big gap that, you know, we're trying to capture now with our fire folks. And, you know, I would love to be more involved in some of those discussions. And it's great to hear, you know, from the perspective of the people that made the sausage, you know, how it's going to turn out. So I'm just glad to be a part of this. So thanks.
Thank you. Wayne.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I certainly like the direction that this small subcommittee is going, and the questions and points that have been brought up. So I certainly look forward to working with everyone to hopefully come up with some solutions to address these. So thanks.
Thank you. Tom.
Sorry, couldn't get unmuted. No, I have just been soaking in all the perspectives and the comments that people are making. Fortunately, Florida has engineering licensing, so the competencies are pretty well can be checked or held in check if they don't perform. Same thing with all of our licensing for inspections, and is kind of puts it a step up, and there is always disciplinary action for those things. We also have a threshold inspection program due to a building collapse that again is based on the number of occupants versus how tall and what the occupancy is, the potential for loss of life. And in South Florida, they even have existing building recertification programs, which may well expand through Florida, especially on the coastline, as we move forward with some of the existing building maintenance, and because that's really a real concern. I mean, it's no different than our transportation concerns. When bridges start collapsing, people start going, maybe we ought to take a look at those. So now, you know, it's focusing on existing buildings. And I think this could well be an asset for having a performance method, even using it for pieces of fixing things. I see this as a great opportunity for us to move forward, because design is going to move forward this way also, especially as people get into doing things, unusual buildings and unusual structures. So I think this is well worth the effort to get this moving again and get it updated, and have it for the a tool in the toolkit for how to design and how to deal with something outside of the box.
Thank you. Nick.
Yeah, I really like the idea of having a framework that could help assist with, I mean, it's not just existing buildings or new buildings that are unique. We are also going to have new construction means and methods coming. I mean, just with the state of everything, it's inevitable that you're going to have change. You're going to have, whether it be into the prefabricated realm or new materials being used. I think having a framework and a guide on how to work on accepting that instead of always being against it would be really helpful. So I like the way it's going with having a framework and a guide to assist.
Thank you. Jack.
Thanks everybody for all of your comments and input today. It's great to hear perspectives from all across the country and even from experience across the pond. Makes me hopeful that in the future we get some folks maybe from overseas who are still dealing with this. I can think of a couple right away from New Zealand and Australia. Jeff, where are you today? I'd love to see Jeff here involved with this, but also to hear from the Jonathan, Sues, and Sams, and people who deal more often with these very unique building types. And so whether that's the Space Needle, whether that's getting more folks involved a little bit who are in jurisdictions that have Disney World and Disneyland and Universal Studios and places where the alternate or the unique or the technology is way beyond what our code is, and they're dealing with that every day. That's their normal job. We'll really start to see the bumps in the road and the roadblocks. And then I hope we all keep in mind that when we talk about potential things like accreditation and some of these things, that when we're dealing with the administrative chapter, and if we move forward and we start to fix that, that's the one that is the most edited, and it will have to be locally in every state typically anyway to balance out rules. Like in Washington, as an example, building officials have all kinds of authority for existing buildings and maintenance and what you can do. In Oregon, there's zero. They cannot even go in there legally without getting a warrant. It has to be the fire code official who can come into any existing building. There's no statutory authority for the building official to do that. So we have those unique things. But I'm pretty excited about the conversation and things that I've learned from some of you today. And I look forward to working together, and I'm happy to be involved any way that I can. So thanks.
Thank you. John?
Yeah, thank you. I don't have a whole lot more to add, I think, other than, I think this is worth doing, but I'm hopeful that it doesn't become a rush job, that we take the time to do it right. Because as we've kind of talked about today, there are a lot of issues I think that do need to be resolved or at least looked at and somehow addressed. And so hopefully we can take the time to do those properly and come out with a good product that'll be useful. I think, the verification stuff is going to be real important, and the auditing, or the competence issue. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Gary?
Say Gary or Darren?
Gary.
Oh, thanks. One sales pitch for those of you on the call: when your 2021 IBC comes out, take a look at the brand new Appendix O, which is an abbreviated version of Chapter 1 of the Performance Code, which I was one of the proponents, and I'm proud of it. But we put it in there so that even though it's certainly not mandatory unless you adopt the appendix, you don't have to go buy or download the Performance Code to get those administrative steps that you might want to consider doing in an alternate method. It started off a little rough before admin, but once we actually got into the explanation, there was broad support on both the admin committee and among the membership to do that. So I really think that, honestly, the tide is shifting on this matter. It's not quick, but I think it is shifting. The sad news is every time we think we make progress, one of the not structural in the building frame, but one of the built-in conflicts in trying to do this at the ICC level is we never sat down and said, this is what we want to achieve. We have a myriad of provisions. We rate a frame. We have thermal performance requirements. We rate the exit way. We limit the distance of the exit way. We're going to add some sprinklers. We're going to add detection and alerting. And a lot of these things are empirical, but a lot of them are intuitive. We think it's a good idea to do this, and then add this, and then add that, without ever really defining what we wanted to achieve at the end of the day, it's kind of hard to say, well, what performs that way? Because how a building performs that's built under the prescriptive code may far exceed what we really, really want in terms of our expectations. But there's an innate reluctance to want to accept something less. So that's going to be the challenge, I think, that any group that goes and looks at this, because we had the same problem 25 years ago. We never really defined what our objectives are. So if you don't say what the intent is, how do you start defining what performs in a similar or equivalent fashion? Like to stay involved, Brian, if you'll have me, and the rest of you will have me.
Thank you. Darren.
I won't say too much other than just to thank everybody. Thanks, Brian, for having me on the group, and everybody else for your input. It's been great. I've had plenty of airtime today. I've got nothing else to add on the substance, but hopefully I'll see you all again.
Thank you. And last word to Mark.
Yeah, thank you. Glad to be here. Really look forward to participating with this in the future. You know, it's honestly I think there's a lot of advantage to this. I think if nothing else, an ongoing resource for us to move forward, you know, in any jurisdiction to be able to have a reference document that we can always use if that's what it even if that's what it ultimately turns into. Hopefully it turns into a very well used and functional document, but if nothing else, it could also be a great reference document to come back to when we run into those kind of difficult performance areas. And I'll be honest, on a selfish note, I just love learning. I've learned like 3 key things just as we sat here today. So every time I get a chance to learn more is a better day. So thank you all, and I look forward to continuing to work with everyone.
Thank you, and thank all of you for giving up your time to engage in this discussion. I really appreciate all the insights and input, and we do have a lot of challenges forward, but I tend to agree with the sentiment that I think it's time, and you know, I think we finally gotten there after 25 years that, you know, maybe going forward is the right thing at this time. So I'll be in touch in a week or so with the summary notes to have you check those. Probably look end of the year, early next year for the opportunity to see all the roundtables. If you want to see what everybody else has to think, will be posted, and then kind of keep the time frame of early February in mind for the workshop. So probably around the 2nd of February for his first session, and 2 weeks later for the second, and then we'll get back together if we can work out timing to continue some of this discussion. And with that, thank you, and we'll close it down for today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.